This will not make you better. It will not give you clarity, and it will not help you achieve anything. These stories are not here to improve your life. They are here to take something away, the constant need to become someone else. You don't need effort. You don't need belief. Just listen, and let the mind grow tired on its own. 21 Zen stories that quiet the mind. Listen slowly. This is not a story about answers. It is about the space where questions dissolve. You don't need to understand. You only need to listen. And even listening can be let go. There was a monk who spent 40 years sweeping the same stone path. Every morning, before light touched the mountains, he would take his broom and move it across the worn stones in long, patient strokes. The path was never dirty. Leaves would fall, yes. Dust would settle. But the path did not need sweeping the way a floor needs sweeping. Still, he swept. One day, a young visitor arrived at the temple and watched the old monk for several mornings. Finally, the visitor approached and said, "Teacher, why do you sweep a path that is already clean?" The monk continued his sweeping. After a long silence, he said, "I am not sweeping the path." The visitor waited. The monk said nothing more. He simply moved the broom, stroke after stroke, until the light changed and the morning became afternoon. The visitor left confused, but the path remained. In a village at the edge of a great forest, there lived a woman who could not stop remembering. Every conversation she had ever had lived inside her like a second voice. Every slight, every misunderstanding, every moment she wished she had spoken differently. All of it played again and again in her mind, especially at night. She went to see a hermit who lived alone in the hills. She told him about the memories, how they followed her, how they spoke louder than the present moment. The hermit listened without moving. When she finished, he stood and walked to a small pond near his hut. He picked up a stone and threw it into the water. Ripples spread across the surface, widening, fading. He picked up another stone. He held it. He did not throw it. He said, "This stone wants to make ripples too." The woman said, "Then throw it." The hermit smiled faintly and placed the stone back on the ground. "I could," he said, "but the pond is already still." He walked back into his hut and closed the door. The woman stood by the pond until the light grew dim. She never went back to see him, but sometimes, when a memory rose in her chest, she would picture the stone in his hand, and she would wonder why he did not throw it. A student once asked his teacher, "What is the mind?" The teacher did not answer. Weeks passed. The student asked again. Still, the teacher said nothing. Months went by, and the student grew frustrated. One evening, he approached the teacher and said, "You will not answer because you do not know." The teacher looked at him quietly and said, "Come with me." They walked into the night, away from the temple, into the open fields where no lanterns burned. The teacher stopped and pointed to the sky. "Do you see the stars?" he asked. "Yes," the student said. "Do you see the darkness between them?" The student looked up. He saw the stars clearly, but the darkness, he had never noticed it before. It was not black. It was not empty. It was simply there, holding everything. The teacher said, "That darkness does not try to be seen." He turned and walked back toward the temple. The student stood alone under the sky. He did not understand, but something in him became quieter. There was a fire in a distant monastery. No one knew how it started. The flames moved quickly, consuming the prayer hall, the sleeping quarters, the library where ancient texts had been kept for centuries. The monks fled into the courtyard and watched as everything burned. One monk, very old, sat on the ground and wept. Another monk, younger, sat beside him. The younger monk said, "Do not cry. We are alive. We will rebuild." The old monk shook his head. "I am not crying because of the fire." The younger monk looked confused. The old monk wiped his eyes and said, "I am crying because I loved those walls." The younger monk did not know what to say. They sat together as the fire burned itself out. By morning, only ash remained. The old monk stood, looked at the ruins, and said, Now I can see the sky. He walked away slowly. The younger monk stayed. He did not understand. But he did not ask. A merchant traveled through a mountain pass carrying a chest of gold. The road was narrow and the cliffs were steep. Halfway through, he met a monk walking in the opposite direction, carrying nothing. The merchant stopped and said, "You walk this pass with empty hands. Are you not afraid of bandits?" The monk smiled faintly and said, "What would they take?" The merchant laughed. "Easy for you to say. You have nothing to lose." The monk looked at the heavy chest on the merchant's back. "And you?" the monk said softly. "Have you found what you were carrying?" The merchant frowned. "What do you mean?" "I carry gold." The monk nodded. "Yes, and it carries you." He continued walking down the path. The merchant stood still for a long time. He wanted to call after the monk, to argue, to explain. But the words would not come. He adjusted the weight on his back and kept walking. The chest felt heavier with every step. There was a painter who became famous for his images of storms. Dark skies, lightning breaking through clouds, waves crashing against rocks. People came from distant cities to see his work. One day, a child looked at one of his paintings and said, "Why do you never paint the calm?" The painter looked down at the child and said, "Because no one would look." The child thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe they don't look because it's already there." The painter did not respond. That night, he sat in his studio and stared at a blank canvas. He picked up his brush. He set it down. He picked it up again. Hours passed. By morning, the canvas was still blank. He hung it on the wall. A woman once traveled for many months to meet a teacher who was said to know the secret of peace. When she finally arrived at his small dwelling in the mountains, she bowed and said, "I have come to learn the teaching." The teacher looked at her and said, "You have already learned it." The woman frowned. "I don't understand. I have only just arrived." The teacher poured tea into 2 cups. He handed one to her. She drank. He said, "How far did you travel to get here?" "Many months," she said, "through forests and rivers and plains." "And when you walked through the forest, did you carry the river?" The woman paused. "No." "And when you crossed the river, did you carry the forest?" "No." The teacher nodded. "Then you already know how to let go." The woman opened her mouth to speak, but the teacher raised his hand gently. "The teaching is not what I say," he told her. "It is what you stop carrying." She stayed with him for 3 days. When she left, she carried nothing she had brought. There was a fisherman who cast his net into the same part of the river every day. He caught very little. One morning, another fisherman passed by and said, "There are no fish here. You should move downstream." The first fisherman nodded but did not move. Days passed. Weeks. The second fisherman returned and saw the first still casting his net in the same place. "You are wasting your time," the second fisherman said. The first fisherman pulled in his net. It was empty. He looked at the other man and said, "I am not fishing for fish." The second fisherman laughed. "Then what are you fishing for?" The first fisherman cast his net again and said, "I am learning to let the river decide." The second fisherman shook his head and walked away. The first fisherman remained. The river moved. The net stayed empty, and still he cast it. A young monk once asked his master, "How do I stop thinking?" The master said, "You don't." The monk looked disappointed. The master continued, "Thoughts are like birds flying across the sky. You do not stop them. You do not chase them. You simply watch." The monk said, "But they are so loud." The master smiled. "Only because you are listening." The monk sat with this for many days. He tried not to listen to his thoughts, but the harder he tried, the louder they became. One evening, he sat by a stream. The water moved over rocks, steady and constant. He noticed that he could hear the water without listening to it. It was simply there. His thoughts were simply there too. He did not stop them. He did not follow them. And slowly, they became like the sound of the water, present but not demanding. He returned to his master and said nothing. The master nodded. There was an old woman who lived at the edge of a field. Every evening, she would walk to the center of the field and stand still. She did not pray. She did not meditate. She simply stood. One day, her neighbor approached her and said, "What are you doing out here every night?" The old woman said, "I am waiting." "For what?" the neighbor asked. "I don't know yet," the old woman said. The neighbor thought this was foolish and did not ask again. Years passed. The old woman continued her walks. One evening, the neighbor saw her standing in the field as always. But this time, the old woman was smiling. The neighbor called out, "Did you finally find what you were waiting for?" The old woman turned and said, "No, I stopped waiting." The neighbor did not understand. But the old woman looked lighter than she had in years. A man climbed a mountain because he heard there was a wise sage at the top. The climb took him 2 full days. When he reached the summit, he found a small stone hut. Inside, an old man sat on the floor, silent and still. The man approached and said, "I have climbed all this way to ask you one question." The sage did not open his eyes. The man waited. After a long silence, he said, "Will you not speak?" The sage opened his eyes slowly and said, "You have already asked 2 questions." The man felt embarrassed. "I apologize. My true question is this: what is the purpose of my life?" The sage closed his eyes again. Minutes passed. Then, without opening his eyes, the sage said, "The same as the mountains." The man frowned. "What is the mountain's purpose?" The sage smiled faintly. "It does not ask." The man stood there, confused and frustrated. Finally, he turned and began the long walk back down. Halfway down, he stopped. He looked at the mountain. It had been there long before him. It would remain long after. He did not wonder why. He sat down on a rock and breathed. For the first time in years, he did not ask himself what he should be doing. There was a monk who never spoke. Not because he had taken a vow. Not because he had nothing to say. He simply found that words often said less than silence. One day, a young traveler came to the temple and demanded to speak with him. The other monks brought the traveler to the silent monk's room. The traveler sat down and said, "I have heard you are wise. I need guidance." The silent monk looked at him. The traveler continued, "I am torn between 2 paths. I do not know which to choose." The silent monk said nothing. The traveler waited. Minutes passed. Growing impatient, the traveler said, "Will you not help me?" The silent monk reached for a cup of tea and took a slow sip. Then he set the cup down and looked at the traveler again. Still, he said nothing. The traveler stood angry now. "You waste my time." He left. But as he walked away from the temple, something strange happened. The noise in his mind grew quieter. And in that quiet, he realized he had already known which path to take. He had simply been waiting for someone to tell him. The silent monk never knew this. He continued drinking his tea. A farmer worked the same land for 30 years. Every season he planted. Every season he harvested. One year a drought came. The crops withered. The soil cracked. The farmer worked harder, watering by hand, praying, trying everything he knew. Still, nothing grew. His neighbor, who had also lost his crops, said, "We should leave. Find better land." The farmer shook his head. "I will wait." "For what?" the neighbor asked. "The rain may never come." The farmer looked at the dry earth and said, "I am not waiting for the rain." The neighbor did not understand. Months passed. The rain did not come, but the farmer stayed. He stopped trying to force the land to grow. He simply tended it, gently, patiently. One morning, a single green shoot appeared, then another. The rain never did come that year, but something grew anyway. The neighbor had already left. He never saw it. There was a student who could not sit still during meditation. His legs ached, his back hurt, his mind raced. He went to his teacher and said, "I cannot meditate. My body will not cooperate." The teacher said, "Then do not meditate." The student looked confused. "But isn't that why I am here?" The teacher smiled. "You are here to sit. Meditation is what happens when you stop trying." The student did not understand, but he returned to his cushion. He sat. His legs ached. He did not try to fix it. His mind raced. He did not try to calm it. Hours passed. Days. One morning, he realized he had been sitting for an hour without noticing. His legs still ached. His mind still moved. But somewhere inside, he had stopped fighting. He did not tell his teacher. There was nothing to say. A woman stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the ocean. She had come there to make a decision. Leave her life behind or stay and endure. She stood for hours. The sun moved across the sky. Finally, a voice behind her said, "Are you going to jump?" She turned. An old man stood there, calm and unbothered. "No," she said. "I'm trying to decide something." The old man nodded. He walked to the edge and sat down, letting his legs hang over. "The ocean does not decide," he said. "It simply moves." The woman looked at him. "That's easy for the ocean. It has no choice." The old man smiled. "Neither do you." She felt anger rise in her chest. "Of course I have a choice. That's why I'm standing here." The old man said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "You think you are choosing between two paths, but you are only choosing whether to accept the one you are already on." He stood and walked away. The woman stayed at the cliff for a long time after he left. Eventually, she walked back down the hill. She did not know if she had decided anything, but the weight felt lighter. A musician spent years trying to compose the perfect song. He tried every melody, every rhythm, every combination of notes. Nothing felt right. One night, exhausted, he set down his instrument and went outside. The night was silent. No wind, no animals, no sounds. He stood in the silence, and for the first time he heard it. Not music, but the space where music could live. He went back inside and picked up his instrument. He played one note, then stopped. He played another, then stopped. The silence between the notes was louder than the notes themselves. He never finished the song, but he stopped searching. There was a monk who spent his life building a garden. Every stone was placed with care, every plant chosen with intention. People came from far away to see it. They walked the paths and marveled at the beauty. One day, a storm came and destroyed half the garden. Trees fell, stones were scattered, paths were washed away. The monk stood in the rain and watched. When the storm passed, a visitor approached and said, "Will you rebuild it?" The monk looked at the broken garden. He knelt down and picked up a stone. He did not place it back where it had been. He set it down in a new place. "I am not rebuilding," he said softly. "I am continuing." The visitor did not understand, but the monk smiled. The garden had never been finished. It had only been changing. A man once asked a teacher, "Why do bad things happen to good people?" The teacher said, "Come with me." They walked to a river. The teacher pointed to the water. "Do you see how the river flows?" "Yes," the man said. "Does it flow only around the rocks you think are worthy?" The man was silent. The teacher continued, "The river does not choose. It simply flows." The man said, "But I am not a river. I am a person. I feel pain." The teacher nodded. "Yes, and the river does not." He paused. "That is the difference, and also the teaching." The man wanted to argue, but the river kept flowing, and the teacher walked away. The man stood there for a long time. He did not find an answer, but the question became quieter. There was a weaver who created intricate tapestries. Each one took months to complete. One day she began a new piece. She worked carefully, thread by thread, for weeks. But halfway through, she realized she had made a mistake near the beginning. One small thread, the wrong color. She could undo it, start over, make it perfect. Instead, she kept weaving. When the tapestry was finished, people came to see it. No one noticed the mistake, except her. One visitor said, "This is flawless." The weaver smiled faintly and said nothing. She knew the flaw was there, but it no longer bothered her. The tapestry was whole not because it was perfect, but because it was finished. A traveler walked through the desert for many days. He carried water, but it was running low. On the fifth day, he saw a well in the distance. He ran toward it, desperate and relieved. When he reached the well, he looked inside. It was empty. He sat down beside it and wept. An old traveler passed by and saw him. "Why do you cry?" the old traveler asked. "The well is empty," the man said. The old traveler looked into the well, then back at the man. "You are not." The man looked up, confused. The old traveler pointed to the water flask still hanging from the man's belt. The man had forgotten it was there. The old traveler walked on. The man sat by the empty well and drank from his own water. Tasted the same as it always had. There was a child who asked her grandmother, "Why do people grow old?" The grandmother smiled and said, "So they can remember what it was like to be young." The child thought about this. Then she asked, "But don't old people forget things?" The grandmother nodded. "Yes, that too is a gift." The child frowned. "How is forgetting a gift?" The grandmother looked out the window at the trees. "Because some things," she said quietly, "are too heavy to carry forever." The child did not understand. But many years later, when she herself was old, she remembered that conversation. And she understood. You have been listening for a long time now. Perhaps you have understood some of these stories. Perhaps you have understood none of them. It does not matter. The stories are not trying to teach you. They are only trying to sit beside you, like a friend who does not need to speak. There is a Zen saying, "The moon does not seek to be reflected in the water." And yet, there it is. You do not need to hold on to anything you've heard. You do not need to remember. The listening was enough. The quiet remains, not because you created it, but because it was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the questions, beneath the need to understand. If you are still awake, that is fine. If you have drifted into sleep, that is fine too. The mind does not need to be controlled. It only needs to be allowed. Like water returning to stillness after a stone has been thrown. The ripples fade, the surface clears, and the moon reflects again. Not because it tried, but because it could not do otherwise. You do not need to do anything now. You do not need to become anything. You are already complete. Not perfect, but whole. The way a broken bowl is still a bowl. The way a leaf on the ground is still part of the tree. Rest now, or don't. Either way, you are exactly where you need to be. The stories end here, but the quiet does not. There was a scholar who collected books about enlightenment. His library filled 3 rooms. He had read every text, memorized every teaching, studied every master. One day, a wandering monk came to his door and asked for shelter. The scholar welcomed him and, eager to share his knowledge, began to speak about all he had learned. He quoted sutras. He explained paradoxes. He described the nature of mind. The monk listened politely. After an hour, the scholar paused and said, "You have been very quiet. Do you not have thoughts on these matters?" The monk looked around at the thousands of books lining the walls. "I do," he said, "but I left them outside." The scholar frowned. "What do you mean?" The monk stood and walked to the window. He pointed at the night sky. "When you look at the stars," he said, "do you read about them, or do you simply see them?" The scholar opened his mouth to respond, but the monk had already laid down on the floor to sleep. The scholar stayed awake all night, surrounded by his books. In the morning, the monk was gone. The scholar never stopped reading, but sometimes, late at night, he would close his books and look out the window, and wonder what it was the monk had left outside. A potter spent decades perfecting his craft. Every bowl, every cup, every vessel, he made them with absolute precision. His work was flawless. People said his hands were blessed. One afternoon, a young apprentice came to learn from him. The apprentice was clumsy. His hands shook. His first bowl collapsed before it could even be fired. The potter watched and said nothing. Days turned to weeks. The apprentice tried again and again. Each piece cracked or bent or fell apart. Finally, the apprentice said, "Master, I will never be as good as you." The potter looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for one of his own perfect bowls. He held it up to the light, and then, deliberately, he dropped it. It shattered on the stone floor. The apprentice gasped. The potter knelt down and picked up one of the pieces. "This," he said softly, "is also a bowl." The apprentice stared at the broken shards. The potter stood and returned to his wheel. "Perfection," he said, "is just another form of fear." The apprentice swept up the pieces, but he kept one fragment in his pocket. Years later, when his own hands had grown steady, he would sometimes hold that fragment and remember. Not the perfect bowl, but the moment it broke. There was a woman who lived beside a mountain. Every morning, she would look up at the peak and feel a longing she could not name. She wanted to climb it. She wanted to stand at the top and see what could be seen from there. But every morning, something stopped her. Work to be done. Responsibilities. Fear of the climb. Years passed this way. One winter, an avalanche destroyed part of the mountain. The peak she had looked at for so long was gone. The mountain was shorter now. Changed. She walked outside and stared at it. A neighbor came by and said, "Such a tragedy. The mountain was so beautiful." The woman nodded. But inside, she felt something unexpected. Relief. She had spent so many years planning to climb it, imagining what it would be like at the top. And now that destination was gone. She realized she could simply walk. Not toward the peak. Just walk. So she did. She walked up the side of the mountain, slowly, with no goal. When she grew tired, she sat. When she grew hungry, she ate. She never reached where the peak had been, but she walked further than she ever had before. A man carried a lantern through a dark forest. The path was narrow and the trees blocked out the moon. He walked carefully, watching each step by the small circle of light. After many hours, he came upon another traveler sitting beside the path. This traveler had no lantern. The first man stopped and said, "How can you sit here in the dark? Aren't you afraid?" The second traveler looked up. "I was," he said, "but then I realized something." "What?" the first man asked. "The lantern only shows you where you are. The darkness shows you everything else." The first man did not understand. He held his lantern higher, trying to see further into the trees. But the light only made the darkness beyond it seem deeper. The second traveler closed his eyes and leaned back against a tree. The first man continued walking, but after a few steps he paused. He looked back. The traveler was still there, eyes closed, completely still. The first man turned forward again and kept walking, but his steps felt heavier, and the circle of light felt smaller. There was a teacher who never answered questions directly. Students would come to him with their doubts, their confusion, their need for clarity, and he would respond with stories, or riddles, or silence. One student, frustrated after months of this, said, "Master, why will you never just tell me what I need to know?" The teacher looked at him. "What do you need to know?" he asked. The student hesitated. I need to know the truth." The teacher nodded slowly. "Open your hand," he said. The student opened his hand. The teacher placed a small seed in his palm and closed the student's fingers around it. "Now," the teacher said, "squeeze as hard as you can." The student squeezed. "Harder," the teacher said. The student squeezed until his hand shook. "Now open your hand." The student opened his hand. The seed was crushed. The teacher looked at the broken seed and said, "This is what happens when you try to hold truth." The student stared at his palm. The teacher walked away. Days later, the student was sweeping the courtyard when he noticed something. A small green shoot had sprouted where he had thrown the crushed seed. He knelt down and looked at it. He did not tell the teacher, but he stopped asking questions. A merchant traveled to a distant city to buy silk. The journey took 3 weeks. When he arrived, he found the silk market closed. A festival had come unexpectedly, and all business had stopped. He would have to wait 2 weeks for the market to reopen. The merchant was furious. He had wasted 3 weeks traveling. Now he would waste 2 weeks waiting. He went to an inn and sat in the corner, bitter and angry. An old woman at the next table noticed him and said, "You look like a man who has lost something." "I have lost time," the merchant said. The old woman sipped her tea. Time cannot be lost, only spent. The merchant scoffed. I have spent it traveling to a closed market. That is the same as losing it. The old woman set down her cup. When you traveled here, did you see the mountains? Yes, the merchant said impatiently. Did you see the rivers? Yes. Did you sleep under the stars? The merchant paused. He had several nights when there was no inn. Then you did not lose time, the old woman said. You simply spent it on something other than silk. She stood and left. The merchant sat alone. 2 weeks later, the market opened. He bought his silk and returned home. But on the journey back, he walked slower. He looked at the mountains. He stopped by the rivers. And at night, he lay on his back and watched the stars. The journey took 4 weeks instead of 3. But he did not notice. There was a monk who never left his room. Not because he was sick. Not because he was afraid. He simply found everything he needed within those 4 walls. Other monks would ask him, "Don't you want to see the world?" He would smile and say, "I am seeing it." One day, a young monk who had traveled to many countries came to visit him. The young monk described all the places he had been, the temples in distant lands, the oceans, the deserts, the cities. When he finished, he said, "You have missed so much by staying here." The old monk nodded. "Perhaps. Don't you regret it?" the young monk asked. The old monk looked around his small room, at the single window, the sleeping mat, the bare walls. "I have been to the mountains," he said quietly. "I have crossed the ocean. I have walked through forests and stood in great halls." The young monk frowned. "But you have never left this room." The old monk closed his eyes. "The room left," he said. "I stayed." The young monk did not understand. He left to continue his travels. The old monk remained, and in the stillness of his room, the world continued to move through him. A woman planted a garden in a place where nothing had ever grown. The soil was rocky. The sun was harsh. The wind was strong. Everyone told her it was impossible. She planted anyway. Every day she watered. She tended. She waited. Weeks passed. Nothing grew. Months passed. Still nothing. A neighbor came by and said, "You are wasting your effort. This land is dead." The woman looked at the empty soil and said, "Perhaps, but I am not." The neighbor shook his head and walked away. Another year passed. The woman continued to water the barren ground. One morning, a single flower appeared. Small, pale, barely alive. But it was there. The woman knelt beside it and wept. Not because the flower was beautiful, but because it had always been there, waiting beneath the soil, not for her effort, but for her patience. There was a man who built a bridge across a river. Took him 10 years. Stone by stone, timber by timber, he worked alone. When it was finished, people crossed it every day. They used it to travel between villages, to carry goods, to visit family. The man would sit by the river and watch them cross. One day, a traveler stopped and said, "You built this bridge?" "Yes," the man said. "You must be very proud." The man looked at the bridge for a long time. "I am," he said, "but not because people use it." The traveler looked confused. "Then why?" The man pointed at the river. "Because now I can see both sides at once." The traveler did not understand. He crossed the bridge and continued on his way. The man remained by the river. He had built the bridge for others, but it had changed him. A musician played the same song every night for 20 years. In the same tavern, at the same hour, people would come to hear it. Some nights the room was full. Some nights it was empty, but the musician played the song regardless. One evening, a young musician approached him and said, "Why do you play the same song? Don't you grow tired of it?" The old musician smiled. "I do not play the same song," he said. The young musician frowned. "But I have heard you. It is always the same melody." The old musician set down his instrument. "The melody is the same," he said, "but I am not." He picked up his instrument again and began to play. The young musician listened. It was the same song he had always heard. But somehow, tonight it sounded different. He could not explain why. The old musician finished and set down his instrument. The young musician said, "Will you teach me that song?" The old musician shook his head. "I cannot teach you the song," he said. "I can only teach you to listen." The young musician stayed in the tavern for many nights after that. He listened, and slowly he began to hear what the old musician meant. There was a man who spent his whole life searching for a treasure. He had read about it in an old text. A treasure buried beneath a tree, in a forest, in a land he had never seen. He sold everything he owned and traveled for years. He crossed mountains. He forded rivers. He walked through storms. Finally, he found the forest. And in the forest, he found the tree described in the text. He began to dig. He dug for days. His hands bled. His back ached. But he kept digging. Finally, his shovel struck something hard. He cleared the dirt away and found a small wooden box. His heart raced. He opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. On the paper, written in faded ink, were the words, "The treasure is not what you find. It is what you become while searching." The man stared at the paper. He wanted to scream, to weep, to curse the cruelty of it. But instead, he sat down beneath the tree, and he began to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. He had spent years searching for treasure, and all along he had been carrying it. A woman went to the ocean every day to watch the waves. She would sit on the sand and stare at the water for hours. One day, her friend came to visit and said, "Why do you come here every day? What are you looking for?" The woman did not look away from the waves. "I am not looking for anything," she said. "Then why do you come?" The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because the ocean does not ask me to be anyone." Her friend sat down beside her. They watched the waves together. After a long time, the friend said, "I understand now." But the woman said nothing, because there was nothing to understand. Only the waves, only the watching, only the being there. There was a gardener who planted a single seed. He watered it every day, carefully, patiently. Weeks passed. Nothing appeared. Months passed. Still nothing. A visitor saw him watering the empty soil and said, "Why do you continue? The seed is dead." The gardener shrugged. "Perhaps. Then why waste your water?" The gardener poured another cup onto the soil. "Because," he said quietly, "I am not watering the seed. I am watering the possibility." The visitor walked away, shaking his head. The gardener continued. Years passed. Nothing ever grew from that seed. But the gardener never stopped watering. Not because he believed the seed would sprout, but because the act of watering had become its own life. And that was enough. A man stood at a crossroads for 3 days. 2 paths stretched before him. One led to the mountains. One led to the sea. He could not decide. Every argument for one path was matched by an argument for the other. On the 3rd day, an old traveler passed by and saw him standing there. "Are you lost?" the traveler asked. "No," the man said. "I am deciding." The traveler looked at the 2 paths. "How long have you been deciding?" 3 days. The traveler nodded. He set down his pack and sat on the ground. "Then you will be here a long time," he said. The man looked at him. "Why do you say that?" The traveler closed his eyes. "Because both paths lead to the same place." The man frowned. "That's impossible. One goes to the mountains. One goes to the sea." The traveler opened his eyes. "And where do you go?" he asked. The man did not have an answer. The traveler stood, picked up his pack, and walked down the path to the sea. The man remained at the crossroads. But now, when he looked at the 2 paths, they did not seem as different as they once had. He chose one, not because it was right, but because standing still had become heavier than walking. There was a teacher who taught without words. He would sit with students and simply be, sometimes for hours. Most students left frustrated. One student stayed for years. He never asked questions. He never demanded answers. He simply sat with the teacher day after day. After 5 years, the student stood to leave. The teacher opened his eyes and said, "You are the first to learn." The student looked at him. I have learned nothing. The teacher smiled. Yes, he said, that is what you learned. The student left. He traveled to distant lands, met many people, lived a full life. But wherever he went, he carried that nothing with him. And it was the heaviest and lightest thing he ever held. A mother once asked her child, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The child thought for a long time. Finally, the child said, "I want to be a tree." The mother laughed. "You can't be a tree." The child looked sad. Years later, when the child had grown, they returned to their childhood home. They found their mother sitting in the garden beneath an old tree. The mother looked up and smiled. "Do you remember when you wanted to be a tree?" she asked. The grown child nodded. The mother reached up and touched the branches above her. "You were right," she said softly. "You should have been a tree." The child sat beside her. They did not speak, but the tree above them moved gently in the wind, and they both felt it. There was a man who collected moments. Not photographs, not objects, just moments. The way light fell through leaves, the sound of rain on stone, the silence between words. He would pause throughout his day and simply notice. He told no one about this. It was not something to be shared. One day he realized he was dying. He lay in his bed and closed his eyes. His family gathered around him, weeping. But inside, he was walking through every moment he had collected. Thousands of them, small, quiet, unremarkable, and yet they were everything. He died with a smile on his face. No one knew why, but he had carried his whole life with him. And it was enough. The night has grown deep now. You have been listening for so long. Perhaps your mind has quieted. Perhaps it has not. Either way is perfect. There is an old Zen poem. Sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes, and the grass grows by itself. You do not need to make anything happen. You do not need to become peaceful. You do not need to hold these stories. They were only ever reflections, like the moon on water, beautiful to see, but impossible to grasp. If you reach for them, they dissolve. If you simply look, they remain. This is true of everything. Your thoughts, your feelings, your life, they are here. You do not need to do anything with them. You only need to allow them. The way the sky allows clouds, the way the earth allows rain, the way silence allows sound. There is nothing broken in you. There is nothing that needs fixing. You are like water, already complete, already flowing, already home. Rest now, not because you are tired, but because rest is your nature. And in that rest, you will find what you were never missing. The quiet, the stillness, the peace that was always there, beneath everything, waiting, not for you to find it, but for you to stop looking. The stories are finished, but you are not. You continue, like the river, like the wind, like the breath that moves through you even now. Gentle, constant, effortless. This is the teaching, not in the words, but in the space between them. You have always known this. You have only forgotten. And now perhaps you remember, or perhaps not. It does not matter. The moon still shines, whether you see it or not.